Snow doesn't just freeze you, it burns first. When Navy SEAL Morgan Reese found the German Shepherd half buried in a mountain drift, she didn't see a hero. She saw a corpse. But the dog's chest hitched. He couldn't hear the storm, but he felt her shadow. Ice coated the windshield of Morgan's battered Ford in jagged crystalline sheets. She sat in the driver's seat, staring through a hastily scraped porthole at the endless stretch of white blurring into the bruised purple sky of the Cascades. Her knuckles, wrapped around a lukewarm thermos of bitter black coffee, were cracked and bleeding. The heater blew tepid air that smelled faintly of exhaust and wet dust. Morgan hated the cold. It made her joints ache, specifically the pulverized cartilage in her left knee and the smooth, raised line of shrapnel scarring that crawled up her collarbone. Yet, here she was, 300 miles from the nearest naval base, isolated in a cabin that lacked cellular service, running from a deployment that had ended in a mess of copper-scented blood and deafening noise. She threw the truck into gear. The tires spun, caught traction on the salted gravel, and lurched forward. She was only supposed to be driving into town for firewood and kerosene, a mundane chore to keep the claustrophobia at bay. The storm was picking up. Powder drifted across the asphalt like pale snakes. It was in that shifting white chaos that her headlights caught a flash of unnatural neon orange. Morgan slammed the brakes out of pure instinct. The truck fishtailed, anti-lock brakes grinding a harsh mechanical stutter into the soles of her boots before slamming into the snowbank on the shoulder. She sat there for a second, the engine idling rough. "Damn it," she muttered, wiping a gloved hand over her face. She squinted through the passenger window. The orange flash was barely visible now, obscured by a rising snowdrift near a rusted highway guardrail. It looked like a piece of trash, a discarded safety vest. But Morgan's eyes, trained to find anomalies in the dense brush of foreign jungles and the rubble of ruined cities, snagged on the shape beneath it. It was too organic, too still. She cut the engine, shoved the door open, and stepped into the biting wind. The cold immediately sank its teeth into her face, stiffening her cheeks. She pulled her wool collar up and waded through snow that reached her mid-thigh. As she closed the distance, the smell hit her before the visual fully resolved. Beneath the ozone scent of the snowstorm lay the distinct metallic tang of dried blood and the musky odor of wet, rotting fur. It was a dog, a large German shepherd, curled into a tight, miserable ball against the steel support of the guardrail. The neon orange she'd seen was a frayed tactical harness, the kind military working dogs wore. But this animal looked nothing like the sleek, muscle-bound K9S she had worked with overseas. This dog was a skeleton wrapped in a matted coat of black and tan. He was tied to the guardrail. A heavy logging chain ran from a thick leather collar to the steel beam, secured with a rusted padlock. Morgan stopped a few feet away. She didn't feel a sudden rush of heroic adrenaline. She felt a deep, exhausted spike of irritation. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered to the wind. She didn't want this. She had come to the mountains to be entirely alone, to stop being responsible for lives she couldn't save. She stood there for a long moment, watching the snow accumulate on the dog's ribs. Then the dog's side rose, a shallow, rattling breath. Morgan sighed, a harsh sound that puffed into a white cloud. She took a step forward, snapping a brittle pine branch under her boot with a sharp crack. The dog didn't flinch. She took another step. "Hey," nothing. The animal didn't raise his head. His ears, normally satellite dishes on a shepherd, remained pinned flat against his skull. Morgan frowned. Working dogs were hypervigilant. Even on the brink of death, a sudden noise usually provoked a twitch, a growl, some instinctual reaction. She reached to her belt, unclipped her heavy folding knife, and struck the steel guardrail with the pommel. Clang! The sound was sharp enough to make her own ears ring. The dog didn't move. She knelt beside him, the snow soaking through her denim. The smell of decay was stronger here. His left hind leg was twisted at a strange angle, the fur torn away to reveal angry, frostbitten tissue. She reached out, her gloved hand hesitating few inches from his snout. If he woke up startled, he could easily take off 3 of her fingers. She pressed her hand flat against his ribs. The moment she made physical contact, the dog convulsed. His head whipped around, teeth snapping blindly at the air. Morgan threw her weight backward, dropping to her back in the snowbank to avoid the bite. The dog scrambled, fighting the heavy chain, his paws slipping frantically on the ice. He didn't bark. He just let out this hollow, raspy wheeze, his amber eyes wide, cloudy, and completely terrified. He looked right at her, but his ears didn't pivot. He's deaf, Morgan realized. Stone deaf. The dog hit the end of the chain and choked, collapsing back into the snow, chest heaving. He was shivering so violently it looked like a seizure. Morgan sat up, brushing snow off her jacket. The irritation was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. She knew the look in those amber eyes. It was the look of a soldier who had been left behind, waiting for an enemy that was going to finish the job. "All right," Morgan said, her voice dropping into the low, steady cadence she used on comms. "You're not dying here, not on my watch." She didn't try to pet him. She didn't offer soothing words he couldn't hear. She approached slowly, keeping herself in his direct line of sight. She pulled off her heavy glove, letting the freezing air bite her skin, and offered her bare palm. The shepherd tracked her hand. He didn't growl, but his lips curled back, revealing cracked, blood-stained teeth. "I know," she murmured, even though it was useless. "I know." She kept her hand perfectly still. It took a full minute before the dog's neck gave out. His head dropped, his wet nose brushing against her bare palm. The touch was agonizingly cold. Morgan didn't waste time. She moved to the chain, wedging the blade of her knife into the locking mechanism of the padlock. It was frozen solid. Cursing under her breath, she bypassed the lock and sliced through the thick nylon collar instead. The material was stiff with ice and dirt, and she had to saw at it aggressively, her knuckles scraping against the dog's freezing neck. When the collar finally gave way, the dog didn't attempt to run. He just lay there, a broken heap. Morgan holstered her knife. "Up we go, buddy." She slid her arms under his front and hind legs, avoiding the mangled left leg. When she lifted, the sheer dead weight of him sent a spike of white-hot agony through her bad knee. She gritted her teeth, tasting blood where she bit her lip, and staggered toward the idling truck. The wind howled, fighting her every step of the way. The dog hung limp in her arms, his head lolling against her chest. He smelled like a damp grave, but beneath her heavy jacket, she could feel the faint, stubborn flutter of his heart. Blood and melted snow pooled on the passenger side floor mats of the truck, soaking into the frayed carpeting. The heater was still fighting a losing battle against the cabin's temperature, but Morgan had cranked it as high as it would go. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of white-knuckle steering and frequent, anxious glances at the passenger seat. The shepherd lay exactly where she had dumped him, folded awkwardly into the cramped space. He hadn't moved. His breathing was so shallow that twice, Morgan reached over and pressed 2 fingers hard against his neck just to find a pulse. Her own heart was hammering a steady, angry rhythm against her ribs. Who ties a dog to a guardrail in a blizzard? When the truck finally fishtailed into the unplowed driveway of her cabin, Morgan didn't bother turning off the engine. She threw the door open, grabbed the dog's tactical harness, and hauled him out. Her knee buckled as her boots hit the icy porch steps, but she leaned into the rough wooden railing, dragging the 70-pound animal inside. The cabin was dark and freezing. She kicked the door shut behind her, plunging them into the dim, gray light filtering through the snow-caked windows. She dropped him gently on the braided rug in front of the cast-iron wood stove. He hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. Morgan didn't stop to take off her boots or jacket. She dropped to her knees, striking a match with trembling fingers and tossing it into the wood stove, which was already prepped with dry cedar kindling. The wood caught instantly, the fire licking up the logs with a sharp, crackling hiss. Next came the trauma kit. She yanked the olive drab bag from under the sofa, unzipping it with a sharp tear of Velcro. The dog was unresponsive. Now that she had him in the light, the full extent of his condition was glaringly obvious. The tactical harness was high-end gear, raptor buckles reinforced stitching, but it was practically hanging off his emaciated frame. She unclipped it, pulling it away. Beneath it, his fur was rubbed raw. Angry red sores, weeping clear fluid, where the heavy straps had chafed him for God knows how long. Morgan's hands moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. It was a coping mechanism. If she viewed him as a casualty, a patient on a triage line, she didn't have to feel the heavy, suffocating weight in her chest. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and cut away the matted fur around his mangled hind leg. The smell was atrocious, sickly sweet and rancid. Infection. The leg wasn't broken, but a deep laceration ran from his hock to his knee, the edges of the wound black and necrotic from frostbite. "You're a mess, aren't you?" she muttered, twisting the cap off a bottle of sterile saline. She flushed the wound. The dog didn't even twitch. As she worked, cleaning the dirt and dried blood away, she noticed a faint blue blur on the inside of his right ear. Morgan paused, gently flattening the ear flap. It was a tattoo, faded but legible. D472. Morgan's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what that was. It was a military identification number. This wasn't some stray, and he wasn't a local pet. He was a veteran, a working dog, likely contracted out to a private military company or a specialized unit, and then discarded when he became a liability. When he went deaf, a sharp, ugly spike of rage flared in Morgan's stomach. It was a familiar anger, the same bitter resentment she carried toward the brass who had written off her own team when a raid went south in a Syrian valley. Broken equipment gets left behind. She bandaged the leg tightly with sterile gauze and pressure wrap, then grabbed 3 heavy wool blankets from the armchair and buried the dog under them. She sat back on her heels, her breath coming in ragged sighs, and watched the slow rise and fall of the wool. For the next 4 hours, Morgan didn't move from the floor. The cabin warmed up, the wood stove radiating a dry, blistering heat. Outside, the storm continued to batter the log walls, the wind screaming through the eaves. She made a bowl of warm chicken broth from a bouillon cube and sat with it between her knees. It happened just as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the floorboards. The blanket shifted. Morgan tensed, setting the bowl aside. The shepherd's head emerged from the wool. His amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown wide in panic. He tried to scramble up, his front paws sliding on the rug, but his injured hind leg gave out, sending him crashing back to the floor. He didn't whine. He didn't bark. He just thrashed, his mouth open in a silent, desperate display of terror. Morgan didn't shout. She knew he couldn't hear her. Instead, she crawled forward slowly, keeping her body low to the ground, her hands flat on the floor where he could see them. The dog snapped at her, his teeth clicking inches from her nose. Morgan didn't flinch. She held her ground, staring directly into his panicked eyes. She moved her hand slowly, deliberately, until her fingertips brushed the floorboards right in front of his paws. She tapped the wood. Tap, tap, tap. The dog froze. He felt the vibration. His eyes darted to her hand, then back to her face. His chest was heaving, pulling desperate lungfuls of air. Morgan tapped the floor again. Gentle, rhythmic. She watched the tension war inside the animal. The instinct to fight, to tear her throat out to protect himself, battling against the crushing exhaustion and the deeply ingrained training of a working dog. Morgan took a risk. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. The dog stiffened, a low, guttural vibration rumbling in his throat. A growl she could feel rather than hear. But he didn't bite. "I've got you," Morgan whispered, knowing he only felt the vibration of her voice through her palm. "You're safe." For a second, the dog stared at her, his amber eyes searching hers with a desperate, piercing intensity. Then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His heavy head dropped onto her thigh, the sheer weight of it pinning her down. Morgan sat there on the hard floor, the scent of wet wool and infection filling her nose, and felt a dangerous, unfamiliar crack form in the walls she had spent the last 2 years building. Mornings in the cabin always smelled like stale coffee, wood smoke, and now the sharp, medicinal burn of iodine. 3 days had passed since Morgan dragged the shepherd out of the blizzard, and survival had settled into a grim, exhausting routine. Sunlight finally broke through the cloud cover, casting harsh, blinding shafts of white across the dusty floorboards. Morgan sat cross-legged on the rug, a roll of medical tape gripped in her teeth, holding Diesel's mangled hind leg steady. He hated this part. She didn't blame him. The necrotic tissue was peeling away, leaving raw, pink flesh exposed to the dry cabin air. It looked angry, weeping a clear, tacky fluid that stuck to Morgan's latex gloves. Diesel's head rested heavily on his front paws, his amber eyes tracking her every micro-movement. He didn't growl anymore, but his body was a coiled spring of tension. His muscles, wasted as they were, twitched under the coarse, oily mat of his coat. "Almost done," Morgan muttered around the tape. She pressed a fresh square of sterile gauze over the wound. Diesel flinched. His ears swiveled forward. A phantom reflex. He was trying to listen to the rustle of the bandages, the scrape of her boots on the wood, the reassuring murmur of a handler. But he got nothing. The absolute silence was driving him insane. Morgan could see it in the frantic, darting movements of his eyes. When you spend your entire life relying on a predatory sense of hearing, its absence leaves a gaping, terrifying void. She wrapped the self-adhering bandage tight, securing the dressing. She tapped his healthy shoulder twice. It was a makeshift system they were slowly figuring out. 2 taps meant release. 1 tap on the floorboards meant attention. A flat palm pressed to his chest meant stand down. Diesel pulled his leg back immediately, tucking it under his belly. He let out a long, shuddering breath through his nose, a sound that vibrated the floorboards just enough for Morgan to feel it in her knees. She stripped the latex gloves off, tossing them into a plastic trash bag beside the wood stove. Her own body was screaming. Her pulverized left knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a souvenir from a collapsed stairwell in Fallujah. The cold always made it worse, but kneeling on hard pine for hours was pure localized agony. Standing up took entirely too much effort. She leaned heavily on the arm of the sofa, waiting for the black spots to clear from her vision. "You're a stubborn bastard, you know that?" she said, looking down at him. Diesel just stared back. He was a working dog stripped of his work. He didn't know how to be a pet. When Morgan moved to the kitchen area to pour another cup of thick, sludgy coffee, Diesel dragged himself up. He wouldn't put weight on his back leg, heavily favoring his front right shoulder, but he hobbled after her. He positioned himself exactly 2 feet behind her right heel. A perfect heel position, or at least as perfect as a crippled dog could manage. Morgan stopped holding the coffee pot. She looked over her shoulder. He sat. His posture was rigid, his chest puffed out slightly despite his prominent ribs. His eyes locked on her face. He was waiting for a command. A tight, uncomfortable knot formed in Morgan's throat. She recognized that posture too well. It was the stance of a soldier who had lost their unit, clinging desperately to the only structure they had left. Routine was a life raft. Without it, you drowned in the memories. Morgan set the pot down. She turned fully to face him. "I don't have a mission for you, buddy," she said quietly. Diesel's brow furrowed. He tilted his head, watching her lips move. He whined, a high, broken sound that physically hurt Morgan to hear. He shifted his weight, offering a tentative right paw. He was trying to guess what she wanted. Shake? Down? Stay? When she didn't react, panic started to bleed into his amber eyes. He began to pant, his hackles raising slightly. The lack of sensory input was short-circuiting his training. He needed a job. He needed to know he wasn't useless. Morgan closed the distance between them. She didn't kneel this time. She stood tall, squaring her shoulders, adopting the authoritative posture of a commanding officer. She caught his eye, pointing 2 fingers sharply toward the braided rug by the fire. She swept her hand down in a crisp, fluid motion. Down. Diesel didn't hesitate. He practically threw himself onto the rug, absorbing the painful impact with a heavy grunt. He settled into a tactical down position, paws crossed, head resting on his forearms, eyes glued to Morgan. He had a job. His job was to stay on that rug. Morgan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, feeling the grit of exhaustion on her skin. They were 2 broken veterans trapped in a wooden box, speaking a language built entirely on trauma and military conditioning. She walked over to the heavy oak table and sank into a chair, staring at the snow glaring aggressively through the glass. The silence in the cabin was heavy, oppressive. Usually she filled it with the static of a ham radio or the mechanical click-clack of field stripping her weapons. But today, the silence felt different. It felt shared. Morgan looked down at her hands. The knuckles were still cracked, but the bleeding had stopped. She glanced over at the rug. Diesel was asleep, his chest rising and falling in a deep, even rhythm. For the first time in 2 years, Morgan didn't feel entirely alone in the quiet. Nightfall brought a bitter, bone-snapping drop in temperature. Frost crept up the inside of the window panes like intricate glass ivy. Morgan was asleep on the sofa, her body tangled in a heavy wool blanket, one hand resting instinctively on the cold steel of the Glock 19 tucked under the couch cushion. She was dreaming of copper, the smell of it, the way it pooled in the dust of a ruined courtyard, the deafening, concussive boom of a breaching charge that vibrated her teeth. A sudden sharp pressure on her chest yanked her awake. Morgan gasped, her eyes flying open. The cabin was pitch black. Her right hand moved with lethal, ingrained speed, gripping the pistol grip of the Glock and pulling it free. Diesel was standing over her. His front paws were planted squarely on her ribs. He wasn't looking at her. His massive head was swiveled toward the heavy wooden front door. His ears were pinned flat. His lips curled back to expose his teeth. The low, guttural vibration tearing through his chest cavity transferred directly into Morgan's sternum. It was a terrifying, primal rumble. He hadn't heard a sound. He had felt it, or smelled it. Morgan shoved the blanket off, sliding her legs onto the freezing floorboards. The pain in her knee flared, but adrenaline instantly smothered it. She thumbed the safety off the Glock, the metallic click swallowed by the darkness. "What is it?" she whispered purely out of habit. Diesel didn't move. He stepped off her chest, placing his body deliberately between Morgan and the front door. His injured back leg was trembling violently under his weight, but he locked his front elbows, refusing to give ground. Morgan felt the floorboards carefully with her bare feet. There was a draft coming from the bottom of the door. The wind had died completely. The woods outside were dead silent. Then she heard it, a heavy, deliberate crunch of snow on the front porch. Not a human footstep. Too soft, too padded. Morgan moved silently, gliding toward the kitchen counter. She kept her weapon raised, tracking the invisible threat through the thick pine planks of the door. Scratch. A thick, raspy sound echoed through the cabin. Claws dragging against wood. Heavy ones. The smell hit the draft a second later. It was thick, musky, and completely feral. It smelled like raw meat and dirty fur. Mountain lion. The storm had driven the wildlife to the brink of starvation, and the scent of Diesel's rotting flesh from the bandages and the trash had acted like a beacon. Diesel's vibration intensified. He took a heavy, limping step toward the door. "No," Morgan hissed, stepping forward and pressing her left palm flat against his flank. He ignored her hand. His hackles were fully raised, a jagged mohawk of coarse black fur running down his spine. He couldn't hear the cougar sniffing at the door jamb, but he could smell it, and he could feel the subtle shifts in weight on the porch planks. He was a military working dog. He was bred and trained to neutralize threats, regardless of his own physical condition. The doorknob rattled. A heavy weight slammed against the wood, testing the frame. The hinges groaned. Morgan brought the Glock up, aligning the tritium night sights with the center of the door. She didn't want to shoot blindly through the wood. Hollow points wouldn't penetrate reliably, and she only had 2 spare magazines. Suddenly, Diesel lunged. He hit the door with his front paws, a silent, vicious snarl contorting his face. He slammed his weight against the wood, challenging the predator on the other side. The lion let out a piercing, unearthly shriek, a sound like a woman being murdered in an alleyway. It reverberated through the cabin, rattling the window panes. Diesel didn't back down. He hit the door again, scratching frantically at the wood, trying to tear his way through to the threat. He was going to get himself killed. Morgan didn't think. She acted. She stepped into the center of the room, raised the Glock toward the thick wooden header above the door, and squeezed the trigger. The 9mm fired with a blinding, concussive crack that momentarily deafened her. The muzzle flash illuminated the cabin in a stark, violent strobe of orange light. Splinters of pine exploded from the header as the hollow point dug into the wood. The physical pressure wave of the gunshot hit Diesel like a physical blow. He flinched violently, dropping to his belly, his eyes rolling back in terror. The sudden, intense vibration in the air scrambled his already damaged senses. He cowered, a pathetic broken whimper tearing from his throat. Outside, the heavy thump of paws scrambling off the porch told Morgan all she needed to know. The gunshot had done its job. The lion was gone. Silence rushed back into the cabin, heavy and ringing with tinnitus. Morgan lowered the weapon. The smell of cordite hung thick and sharp in the air, masking the feral musk of the cat. She looked down. Diesel was pressed flat against the braided rug, shaking uncontrollably. The gunshot had triggered every ounce of PTSD he possessed. He was back in whatever war zone had stolen his hearing, trapped in a silent world of explosive pressure and blinding flashes. Morgan's own heart was hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving a cold, nauseating sweat in its wake. She safed the weapon and set it on the table. She didn't reach for him immediately. She knew better. Instead, she dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp stab of pain, and sat on the floor about 3 feet away. She waited. Minutes dragged by. The cold seeped through Morgan's thin t-shirt, raising goosebumps on her scarred collarbone. Finally, Diesel lifted his head. His eyes were wide, panicked, searching the room for the enemy. Finding nothing, his gaze locked onto Morgan. Morgan took a slow, deep breath. She raised her left hand, palm flat, and pressed it firmly against the floorboards. "I'm here. We're safe." Diesel stared at her hand. Then, slowly, painfully, he dragged himself across the distance. He didn't stop until his heavy head rested solidly against Morgan's thigh. Morgan didn't pat him. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply rested her hand firmly on the back of his neck, burying her fingers in his coarse fur, grounding him in the present. They sat there in the dark, the scent of gunpowder lingering in the air. 2 broken soldiers holding the line together. Thaw arrived 3 weeks later, smelling aggressively of rotting pine needles, wet dirt, and stagnant water. The brutal winter broke like a fever. Snowbanks receding to reveal a landscape of slick brown mud and exposed gray granite. Diesel's leg didn't fall off. The deep infection surrendered to the heavy course of scavenged antibiotics, leaving a jagged ridge of shiny pink scar tissue that pulled his hide tight. He walked with a heavy, syncopated limp, his left hind paw dragging through the slush. He was shedding his dense winter coat in massive, oily clumps that drifted across the floorboards. Morgan swept them up daily. It was another chore, another mechanical anchor to the waking world. She fashioned a makeshift sling from a canvas duffel strap to help him walk the cabin's perimeter. The physical labor of hauling him through the mud left her breathless, her bad knee screaming. But Diesel never quit. He'd stumble into the freezing muck, then simply drag himself back up. His eyes would lock onto her hands, waiting for the next silent command. A stubborn, ugly kind of survival. The exact kind Morgan understood. Standing on the porch, black coffee cooling in her hand, she watched snowmelt carve trenches down the driveway. Diesel sat by her left leg, his hip pressed firmly against her denim. He needed contact to tether himself to his surroundings. Without it, the silent world was a sensory vacuum that triggered endless, anxious pacing. "All right," Morgan muttered, dumping the dregs of her coffee into the mud. "Time to face the music." She tapped her thigh twice. Diesel stood, his amber eyes locking onto her face. She pointed a single finger toward the rusted Ford. The road down the mountain was a treacherous ribbon of washed-out asphalt. Morgan fought the wheel, suspension groaning over jagged craters. Diesel sat rigidly in the passenger seat. Instead of cowering, he braced his paws against the dashboard, his heavy head swiveling with mechanical precision. He tracked the towering firs, the logging trucks kicking up brown spray, and the hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers. His jaw was clenched tight. Morgan kept her right hand resting on the center console. Every few minutes, Diesel would lower his snout and press it hard against her knuckles, feeling the steady vibration of the engine block translating through her skin. It was his only tether. Town was a depressing strip of faded storefronts and a veterinary clinic operating from a converted double-wide trailer. Morgan pushed the glass door open, the bell jingling, a sound Diesel ignored. The waiting room hit her senses like a physical blow, smelling overwhelmingly of industrial bleach and the stale, yeasty odor of dog treats. Diesel didn't hear the chaotic barking of a golden retriever tethered nearby, but he felt the sharp, frantic thumps of its paws against the linoleum. The vibration sent a tremor through his hindquarters. He crowded Morgan's legs, boxing her into the corner, positioning himself between her and the source of the vibration. Morgan didn't scold him. She rested her hand flat between his shoulder blades, applying steady pressure. "Hold the line." Diesel forced himself to sit, muscles bunching like coiled wire. The vet, Henderson, wore a faded flannel under a stained lab coat, smelling of tobacco and rubbing alcohol. He took one look at Diesel, noting the blue D472 tattoo inside his ear flap, and sighed. "Military working dog," he grunted. He ran calloused hands over Diesel's prominent ribs, then down the mangled hind leg. Diesel stiffened, lips curling back slightly, but his eyes darted instantly to Morgan's left hand, resting flat on the steel examination table. She tapped the metal once. "Stand down." Diesel swallowed hard, closing his mouth, though his chest continued to heave. "He's deaf," Morgan said flatly. "I figured," Henderson replied, checking the dog's pupils with a penlight. "Concussive trauma, likely. Explains the state you found him in. Some private contractor realized he couldn't hear commands, decided he was a liability and dumped him to save the cost of a bullet. Seen it before." Morgan's jaw locked. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a high-pitched whine. She looked at Diesel. He watched her face with agonizing intensity, relying entirely on her physical cues to dictate his reality. If she panicked, he would attack. If she breathed steady, he would endure. He surrendered his entire survival instinct over to her. The weight was suffocating, yet oddly stabilizing. "He's 50 pounds underweight," Henderson said, snapping off his gloves. "His cartilage is shot. He'll have severe arthritis in that back leg. And he's got PTSD so bad, he's practically vibrating off the table." He met Morgan's cold eyes. "You brought him in from the ridge, right? Living off-grid?" "Yeah. It's a massive undertaking. He's a weapon with a broken safety. The most humane thing to do, considering his trauma." "No," Morgan cut him off. Her voice possessed a dense, lethal gravity that killed the conversation. Henderson paused, reading her rigid, squared-off posture. He saw the faded shrapnel scars, the hypervigilance in her eyes, her hand hovering in a tactical position. He nodded slowly, recognizing the exact same broken machinery in the owner as he did in the dog. "Okay," Henderson said quietly, reaching for a prescription pad. "Let's get him some joint supplements." The drive back was cast in the anemic light of dusk. The sun dipped below the Cascades, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple. Morgan navigated by memory, headlights cutting the mist. She parked in front of the cabin. She turned the key. The engine shuddered and died. The heater fan spun to a halt. Usually this was the part she hated. The exact moment the mechanical noise stopped, the memories would rush in to fill the vacuum. The smell of copper, the choking dust, the screaming of her team. But as she sat there in the freezing cab, she felt a heavy, warm weight settle onto her right arm. Diesel had shifted across the bench seat. He rested his massive head squarely on her forearm, his amber eyes blinking slowly in the dim dashboard light. He couldn't hear the silence. He didn't care about the ghosts in the dark. He only cared about the steady, reassuring pulse of her blood beneath his jaw. Morgan stared at the dark, empty cabin through the frost-rimmed windshield. It wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a perimeter. She reached over, her cracked fingers gently tracing the faded blue numbers on his ear. She didn't feel fixed. Her knee still burned. The nightmares were still waiting inside. She was still deeply, fundamentally broken. But as Diesel let out a long, rumbling sigh that vibrated straight through her bones, Morgan realized she was no longer waiting to die in the snow. She tapped the dashboard twice. Let's go home. Healing isn't a pristine, cinematic finish. It's dirty bandages, restless nights, and choosing to wake up anyway. Morgan and Diesel didn't magically cure each other, but they gave one another a reason to hold the line. If this raw story of survival struck a chord with you, leave a like and share it with someone who understands the weight of carrying invisible scars. Don't forget to subscribe for more grounded, gritty stories of human resilience. See you next time.